Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. So I want to start by telling you where I come from, and it is actually Poland, a town called Portugal. I was the middle child of three, with an older brother Ben and the younger sister Lucia. And before the war, my life was very happy in a loving family, and I did all the usual things that children did in those days. And I won't concentrate on that because I have to tell you 5.5 years of my war history. And so there's an awful lot to tell. So this will just give you an idea of what it was like during the Holocaust, when one was on the wrong side of the barrier. Being Jewish, of course, we were immediately targeted. So my happy pre-war life came to a very abrupt end on the 1st of September 1939, when the Germans, the bombing started, and we were invaded very quickly. Now, I am Jewish, and so it was declared on the 1st of September, the war broke out on the 1st of September, and by the 1st of November, 2 months into the war, announcements were made that there's going to be a ghetto. Our town was the first one to have a ghetto. So within 2 months of the war, by the 1st of November, we had already been forced out of our homes and into ghetto walls. There weren't physical walls there, but the ghetto was very heavily guarded. And people over the age of 12 had to wear a white armband on the forefront with a blue Star of David. We were not allowed out of the ghetto at any time. We were deprived of the most basic human rights, and we were very vulnerable. Now, the only chance of survival really was for just the middle group, people of working age. They had no use for children or old people, and so we were the most vulnerable. Schools stopped for children, for Jewish children, and food in the ghetto was very short. We were subjected to all sorts of beatings and other atrocities, and life was very limited. There were constant deportations, people were being taken away, we didn't know where to. At first it was camps, but the camps got consistently worse and worse, and I won't spend too long on the ghetto, but only to tell you that on the first after about 2.5 years in the ghetto, rumors started circulating that the ghetto was going to be liquidated and everybody was going to be deported. And we knew what that meant, because the deportations were going to camps like Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek. There were camps, they were really death camps. There was no work there or anything. People were sent there just to be gassed and then incinerated. And so panic broke out. People tried to save themselves. There were various ways and means, but they were all dangerous and some very expensive. Now, some of the ways was to smuggle oneself out of the ghetto, which was very dangerous because one could be killed right at the outset doing that. But, and then perhaps live outside in the forests or in the sewers, anywhere to avoid deportation. And some people had friends outside who would perhaps save a member or two of the family. And another way was that some people were doing it for money. And my parents, together with my aunt and uncle, the Kleins, were introduced to men from Częstochowa, a town not too far away, about an hour or an hour and a half by train. And this man was prepared to save 2 Jewish girls, but he was going to be paid for that. It was a business. And he was not only Christian and Polish, but he was actually of German origin. So that town, Częstochowa, was actually sort of on the border, almost on the border of Germany. And there were quite a lot of Germans living there. And because of his status, he enjoyed a lot more privileges than the ordinary Poles. And for that reason, he was going to be even dearer. He was actually doing it for money. So I remember this man being smuggled into the ghetto to collect his money and also to make arrangements. And his conditions were that he will take us, one at a time, a week apart, to Częstochowa. And he said that you take me first, and my cousin, he'll come back for my cousin. And we knew that the journey itself was going to be very treacherous because there was actually a reward for handing in Jews. And some people made it into quite a lucrative business. So if anybody looked at us for longer than a few seconds, we would immediately imagine that they suspect us of being Jewish. I mean, this was one at a time, but I'm speaking for both of us at the different times. And we would be terrified of that. If they discovered that we're Jewish, we could be arrested by the Gestapo we knew the consequences that would await us. So that was just one of the things. Of course, we were going to travel on false papers with false names. And we got over the journey, we arrived, we found ourselves in a house on the outskirts of Częstochowa with a middle-aged couple. Now, the men who actually made all the arrangements and with whom we traveled was their son-in-law who lived around the corner with his wife and child. And these people weren't exactly pleased to have us, but they tolerated us. And but nevertheless, we were very scared and we were very nervous. Well, for one thing, we were away from home. We were homesick. And we had to pretend to be people who we were not, and we were very upset and worried and vulnerable and in danger. And I'll give you one example of, we were supposed to be relatives who had come to stay from Warsaw. And if there was a knock on the door, it was okay. Sometimes it was okay for us to mix, but other times they would quickly bundle us into a cupboard under the stairs, anywhere out of sight, if there were any visitors. So we never knew where we were. And on one occasion, when we were mixing with visitors, one of them started a conversation with me. He started by saying, I understand that you're visiting from Warsaw. Where do you live in Warsaw? Well, by then, I was so terrified that he was suspecting me of being Jewish that I forgot my false address on the false papers. And I was really stuck, but I did think of an idea, and I simply made up an address, and it was okay. He really wasn't interested in the address. He was just being sociable. So that was one of the lucky times when it was okay. It passed without any consequences. But we were constantly exposed to all sorts of dangers. And my cousin, who was, now I'll tell you, she was 10 and I was 11. And she was an only child. So she was so terribly homesick and so unhappy. She really couldn't bear it. And she asked to be taken back to her parents. She was told that the deportations are still going on and she can't go back. She said that her parents have very good friends in Portugal who are hiding their valuables, her parents' valuables, and they'll take her in. So he said, okay, he took her to these good friends. And I was languishing there for what seemed like a lifetime. But eventually the time came for me to go back. And lots of things happened during that time, but of course I don't have time to tell you details. So the time came for me to return to Portugal. Arrangements were made for us to travel back to meet my father in a flour mill, which before the war belonged to him in partnership with his brother and another man. Now he was lucky to have a job there. So when we got into this large room at the top as a big storeroom, there was my father waiting for me, but also my uncle, Joseph Klein, Ija's father. My uncle looked at us and he went white with shock. He said, "Where's my daughter?" And the man said, "I took her to your good friends," he mentioned the name. And my uncle said, "But she's not there. Where is she? What have you done with my child?" And I still remember vividly my uncle with his hands behind his back, looking at the ground and pacing there and back, saying, "What have you done with my child?" And this is the end of the story, because nobody till this day knows what happened to Ija. My uncle was arrested soon afterwards, and so was my father, and two other uncles and a lot of other people. They were held in the local jail. Some of them were released, my father among them, and the rest were taken to the Jewish cemetery, lined up against the wall and shot. So my aunt lost her daughter and her husband within a very short space of time. She survived the war, and as soon as she was released from concentration camp, her first priority was to go back to Poland and see what happened to Ija. Now, the German people had fled. They were nowhere to be seen. The good friends told her that the man turned up with Ija, and they collected a suitcase full of valuables, and he left with Ija and the suitcase. And my aunt said to me, "How could anybody kill a child for the sake of some goods? I would have given him everything I possessed if only he saved her." And on another occasion, she said something. We used to meet occasionally, and we didn't talk much about Ija. because neither of us knew very much and it was too painful. But on another occasion, she did say to me something so terribly sad that I hesitate to repeat it, but I'll tell you. She said, my Ija had to walk into the gas chamber by herself. There was nobody to hold her hand. And this is the pain she lived with for the rest of her life. Soon after that, when I was returned to my father, I went back into the ghetto with the working party. And you'd think that a small girl with grown men in a column won't be noticed, but it wasn't like that because they were always searching and counting and looking at papers. But at that time, they didn't do that. They turned a blind eye because they had their agenda. And I'll just tell you a little bit about the ghetto because I didn't tell you the figures. The original ghetto, our town actually had 15,000 Jews in it, but at its height, the ghetto had 28,000 Jews in it. And you may wonder why, but that is because there's a certain amount of space. I usually have a PowerPoint and I can point things out to you, but a certain amount of Poland was immediately annexed. And any Jews in that area had to immediately move out. Or they didn't move out, they were deported. And most of them found their way into our ghetto. So it grew from 15,000 to 28,000. But the overcrowding was such that a lot of people died through various epidemics that raged because of not only the overcrowding, but also the sanitary arrangements, which were very inadequate. So when I returned to the ghetto, the deportations had taken place. And the ghetto was now reduced from the 28,000 to 2,400 people. And they were mostly men of working age. And they had jobs. There were two very large concerns outside, which were ultimately turned into labor camps. One was glassworks, and the other one plywood producing concern, very, very enormous place. So in the meantime, they built the barracks for the slave laborers that were going to work there. And the ghetto was sort of still going on for a little while, because apart from anything else, they started rounding up the people that had returned. Some people managed to return afterwards into the ghetto, like I did. And they started rounding they were called the illegals, and they started rounding them up. When I got back, I found my family intact, but that was very unusual. Most families were completely dissipated. There may have been one or two members left. So my brother had a work permit. My father, mother, and sister were living with three different families, Polish families, during the deportations. So our family was safe, but alas, not for long, because after they thought that all the people who had hidden themselves and were returning, and they looked the other way, when they thought that everybody was back, then they started rounding them up. And on one occasion, they stormed into a room where my mother was with my sister and a lot of other people. They took them away to the synagogue. The synagogue by then was very dilapidated and used for stables, and it wasn't really a place to live in, but they were kept in there without any food or water or sanitary provisions. And every day they were going around looking, searching, and adding more people. And when they had 560 in the synagogue, mostly women and children, well, people of working age as well, because they were away being hidden. They took them out, well, they marched them at dawn in groups of 50 to the local forest called Rakov. And there they were murdered in the most horrific way. We know exactly what happened because people came to tell us, witnesses came to tell us, but in any case, it is well described in quite a lot of books. And I'll mention just one in case anybody's interested to read about it, and that is a book by Christopher Browning. He's an American historian, and the book is called Ordinary Men. Well, so my mother and sister died in this most horrific way. Well, you know, I said there were groups of 50 being taken out, and of course there was a column of them going along, and some people called it that they were walking to their own funeral. And the murders were really horrific. After that, there were still 3 of us left, my father and my brother, because they both had jobs, and I miraculously was saved. I won't go into the details how I managed to stay out of it. They were still rounding people up. They were still getting more people for whatever reason they needed them or wanted them. Sometimes it was for other work in other towns or other ghettos. And on one occasion, they rounded up my aunt, the Holocaust side of the family, my father's side. And my aunt was taken away screaming, who will look after my child? She had a 5-year-old daughter. And at that time, I was the only female health court of the family left, and it was down to me. I was 12, and my cousin Ija, my cousin Anne, Ija had already disappeared. My cousin Anne was 5, and I looked after her. Soon after that, they liquidated the ghetto, but before they did that, and before the 2 sets of workers who were going to go to these factories I mentioned to you earlier, they knew that there were still some illegals, as they called them, left in the ghetto who had no work and who had no right to be there. So they were still searching. Of course, I was among them. I was one of those illegals. And on one occasion, they stormed. No, that was my mouth. I'm sorry, but I just feel a little bit tense about it. So they knew that there were still some people in there, and they started searching for them. And they took them outside, and I was among those people because I was illegal. So they took them outside, and they continued searching until they had, I don't know in numbers how many there were, but I can tell you that was a column about 4 to 5 wide, and it was perhaps as long as this room. There were mostly women and children and elderly men. And we were standing in this long column waiting to be deported, and lorries were coming up in the front, and people were being loaded on and taken away. I was standing towards the end with my little cousin, and it was all quite horrifying. All deportations were, and this one was not much different. For instance, there was a woman in front of me with a baby in her arms, and suddenly she was hit over the head with a rifle butt, and her head was streaming with blood. The baby was screaming, she was crying, and it was all horrific. And the column was moving forward, but I looked right. I don't know what gave me the idea, but I looked and I saw that there was an officer, a German officer, who was obviously in charge. And I stepped out of line. I went up to him and said that, well, he was flabbergasted to see me even speaking to him, because, you know, I could have been shot for just stepping out of line, but because I managed to get to him, he listened to me, and I said that I've been separated from my father and brother. They're inside the ghetto. Could I go back to them? And he sort of looked surprised and a little bit amused. I still remember his face. He had a kind face. He called over a Jewish policeman and said, "Take her back inside the ghetto." And on the way, I said to the policeman, "Just a moment, I got to get my cousin." And he said, "You can't, because she hasn't had permission." And I said, "But I can't go back without her. I can't go back and ask him again." And really, I was stuck. I kept arguing with him. But I just want you to think about this particular incident, because I had a dilemma, and the Holocaust was full of such dilemmas. That was not unusual. And in addition to all the other atrocities, people suffered these personal situations that were sort of impossible to resolve or to do anything about. So I just carried on. I really, what was I to do? Go to, you know, abandon my little cousin, or lose the chance to be reunited with my father and brother? But in the end, I don't know what was in this policeman's mind, but he probably got fed up with me arguing, and in the end he said, "Quickly go through the gates." So that was a real bit of luck, because I can tell you, I wasn't able to show the PowerPoint here because I've got all the pictures of the memorial stones. Those, had he not let me go back, I would have ended up in the same forest as my mother and sister, but at a different time. And there is a memorial to these children, which says that they were murdered in July of the following years, a few months later. And apparently what happened, I didn't witness it because I had gone back into the ghetto, but apparently the people in charge said to the mothers, because these were mostly mothers and children and elderly people, that not people for work. And they said to the mothers, "You are going to be deported to a labor camp. You won't be able to look after your children. Give us the children. We're going to build a home, a children's home for them, and they'll be all right." And they handed over the children, and this is where they ended up, in Rakow Forest, and there's a memorial for them. Well, after that, there were just two groups of people. That one went to the glass works called Hortensia, and I was my father and brother, we were allotted to the plywood place, which was called after the men who looked after it, who confiscated it, and their name was Tribich and Fischer. That was the official name of the company. Now, although there's still 4 of us, and you would think we're still a little tiny family, but it wasn't like that, because in these labor camps, men and women were always housed separately. So I was with my little cousin, with the women at one end of this very large place, and Ben and my father were together with the men at the other end of this place. At the age of 12, I became a slave laborer, and my little cousin Anne, who was so attached to me, she wouldn't let me out of her sight. She couldn't work. She was only 5 and very small and frail. And so she stayed behind, but because we worked shifts, there were always some people there to keep an eye on her. We weren't there very long, about 18 months, a little more than 18 months. I won't go into details, but I mean, we worked very long shifts, and we had very little food, and we went through an awful lot. But after about, as I said, more than 18 months, maybe 20 months, we were deported. They walked us to the railway station, men separately from women. We didn't know where we were going, but I can tell you now that the men were deported to Buchenwald concentration camp, and I, with the women, found ourselves in Ravensbrück concentration camp. Has anybody heard of Buchenwald or Ravensbrück? You have. You're very much more knowledgeable than school children, but still, they've still got time to learn. So when we arrived at Ravensbrück, the first thing they did was take everything away from us, which wasn't a lot, but they took it. Then we had to queue up and give our details, because you know the Germans were meticulous at record keeping. In fact, on my PowerPoint, I've got a list of the original list typed on a pre-war typewriter with my name on it, and my cousins and my aunts. It's a list of the last Jewish women to be deported from Piotrków to Ravensbrück. Now, the next thing, after taking everything from us, they took our details. Then we had to undress. Our clothing was taken away. Our heads were shaved. We went through cold communal showers. And when we got out at the other end, they gave us the concentration camp garb, this striped jacket and skirt. And when we looked at one another, we seriously could not recognize each other. We all looked exactly the same. And it's very difficult to describe what it does to you, what it does to your soul. You're stripped of your personality, your identity. You suddenly become just like an object, because well, you've probably seen pictures, but to be actually in that position, it really does something to you. And one of the things it does, it makes you lose hope. And without hope, there is no survival. We ended up in the barracks with 4 to 1 sort of bed on the bunks. And some people worked, I didn't. And our rations were half a slice of bread, black bread, I don't know what it was made of. But anyway, we were glad to have it. some soup, some grey liquid called soup, and some brown liquid called coffee, and occasionally there was a knob of margarine. The people who worked, some of them worked in fields, they were picking vegetables and digging up vegetables in the winter. This was a really cold winter, and this was in between November and February. And one of my aunts who was on that transport, and you know, this loss of hope really showed itself very quickly. My aunt, Franja Klein, died within a very short time of arrival. My best friend, Pema Blachman, died soon afterwards. People were just giving up. And some of the women worked in the fields, and my aunt was one of them. And I remember on one occasion she brought me back a turnip, which was wonderful, but of course she risked her life. Anyone stealing vegetables, I mean bringing anything back, could be shot on the spot. We were there about, I won't go into details of what it was like. I mean, the thing that really imprinted on my mind, one of the things is the roll call. We used to stand on this Appellplatz, as they called it in German, for what seemed like hours. And so they could count us, and it would start 6 o'clock in the morning, and it was freezing cold. But anyway, I won't go into details, only to tell you that in February, they deported us again, and this time we found ourselves after a shorter journey. The other one was a 4.5-day journey. It was quite horrific in cattle trucks. Well, this time we found ourselves in Bergen Belsen. Has anybody heard of Bergen Belsen? You have. Well, has anybody seen the film on television of Bergen Belsen? No? Well, it's a great pity, because it was 2 years in the making. It received top awards, and it really tells you the story of Belsen. And because I was there, I'm actually in the film, but that's not what I'm telling you, because there were several of us in the film. But it's a pity if you missed the opportunity, because there were at least 3 films that I know of that were on television within those 2 days of the Holocaust Memorial Day. And really, I feel quite sad that people didn't sort of have the benefit of seeing them, because they're not films on general release. And if you've missed them, I don't know how you can see them. But not only that, but because I was in Bergen Belsen, it would have saved me a lot of telling you what it was like if you saw that film, and more, because that film takes an hour, so there's a lot to say in it, and some of the people, the liberator, I mean, it was really worth watching. So when we arrived at Bergen Belsen, we were greeted in the usual way with, we could hear the dogs barking outside and the clanking of the doors, and the soldiers with their rifles at the ready and shouting "Raus, Raus" in German, and then we had to sort of get into a column, and they walked us to the camp. It was quite a long walk, I don't know, perhaps an hour or more. And when we arrived there, they said they didn't have room for us. They put us up in a tent overnight. The next morning, we went into the camp, and what we saw, what I remember, defies description. It was like something out of hell. The first thing that struck you was the smell. and this sort of smog. And there were people in there, but there were skeletons. And they were shuffling along aimlessly. And they would just shuffle along and collapse and die. So the place was full of dead bodies. And there were piles of bodies and piles of naked, twisted, decaying corpses. It was just like a horror film. And the overcrowding was such that a barrack that should have had 80 to 100 people in it had hundreds. And I've read some reports. I mean, I wasn't going around counting them, but I read quite a few reports from medical journals, so I would say that they're very reliable. And one of them described the numbers as 1,000 in one of the barracks. On the way to the barracks, I heard that there was a children's home somewhere in the camp. I quickly set out with Anne to find it. And we were interviewed by two women, Sister Luba and Dr. Binko. If you read about Bergen Belsen, you come across their names. And after asking us a lot of questions, one of them said to me, well, we are also very overcrowded, but in any case, you are too old, she said to me. And I said, okay, I understand, will you take my cousin? And of course they were going to take her anyway. She's very small and frail. And they agreed to take my cousin, but there was no way she was going to leave me. No one could have persuaded her to leave me. And they could see that they tried, but in the end, they relented and took us both in, which was a real piece of luck, because I know that no way would we have survived on the main camp. Now, this barrack was, had children who were Dutch. It was an amazing history of their own, which I don't have time to tell you. And conditions were only minutely better. But the best thing about it was that suddenly we were in the care of adults, and and they were kind to us, because really there was hardly any food left in the camp anyway. So we didn't have much more, but we did have a little bit more, and we were looked after. But even in those marginally better conditions, I succumbed to typhus. And I remember lying on my upper bunk by the window. I must have come out of my unconsciousness. And I saw people running. And I had no idea where they were running or why they were running. That didn't interest me. But what I did wonder is, how did they have the strength to run? And that was the 15th of April, 1945, when we were liberated by the British forces. And I'll stop here, and you're welcome to ask me any questions you like. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. We will open up straight to the audience for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, wait for the microphone to come to you, and please stand up while asking your question. Could we start with the member there?
Thanks very much for sharing your testimony with us. Could I ask you, what do you remember about the days after Bergen Belsen was liberated?
Okay, now I had typhus. I couldn't walk, I couldn't do anything. And actually they had a terrible job on their hands. I've since listened to a historian, a war historian, who described how they found themselves having to have 2,000 beds ready by the next day. And they didn't even have the materials for them, but the army are just wonderful at improvising and getting things done. And I was simply lying there, and things didn't change for me very much for a day. But then the day after, 2 soldiers arrived with a stretcher. And when I saw that, I said, and you probably won't believe that, I don't believe it myself, I said, oh, I'll walk. Well, of course, I got off, I promptly collapsed. They put me on the stretcher and took me to the hospital. They did create a hospital, there was a garrison town nearby in Bergen Belsen. And there they did wonders for people. So I don't really remember very much because I was hospitalized. I just remember the kindness and the wonderful attention. And then gradually sort of it got better. But I don't remember the things that I think people expect me to remember, the joy and the happiness of being liberated. But, you know, I don't think any of us had the strength even to rejoice. And we were preoccupied thinking, well, who survived? And I thought, well, I knew about my mother and sister. I didn't know what happened to my father and brother. And, well, I thought I was left alone in the world. And as it happened, I can tell you now, save somebody asking it, my brother survived, but he was the only other survivor of my family. So there were just the 2 of us, but we didn't find one another till quite a long time later.
How did you find one another?
How do we, actually, people have been asking that since these films, because has anybody watched the Windermere Children? Yes, some people have. So you'll know what I'm talking about, because they are a story of themselves, and they made it into they called the film a drama, which it was, but it was a true drama. And then there's another part of the film where they interviewed the actual boys, as we called them then. So my brother, in fact, when people started asking me, how did we find each other? I said, well, wait a minute, I've got to ask my brother. I couldn't pinpoint the time when we actually, realized that the other one is alive. So Ben told me that he went straight back to Poland, straight after the war. He was liberated in Theresienstadt. And he went back to Piotrków, our town, to see if there's anybody left who survived. And he met somebody there who told him that she saw me in Bergen Belsen after the war. And that's how he knew that I was alive. I didn't learn that he was alive until many months later. I was sent to, with my cousin and a lot of other children, to Sweden after the war, about 3 months after the war. And Sweden actually opened their gates to people. They were taking in lots of children, adults, anyone who was involved in the war, who suffered, who needed help, and they were wonderful. So I went to Sweden. Ben, on the other hand, came to England with a group of children who became known as the boys, but they were girls among them as well. There were 732 that came in several groups from Theresienstadt. And so there's actually a book about them called The Boys. The reason it's the boys and not the girls and the boys is that people who befriended them and came to see them and helped them used to inquire about them when they saw anybody who was involved, and they would say, oh, how are the boys doing? And they just called them the boys forevermore. And the girls didn't get a mention. Some of them were very upset about it, because there's actually a book called The Boys by Sir Martin Gilbert. I'm sure you all know who Sir Martin Gilbert was. He died not so long ago. He was the biographer of the Churchill biographies. You know, he was the writer of the Churchill biographies. And these boys became quite well known, and Ben was among them. And well, at some point, I was also making inquiries at my end, and I found that Ben was in England and I was in Sweden, and it was decided that I should come. Well, we obviously wanted to be reunited, and the decision was made, which turned out to be a very good decision as far as I'm concerned. And I came to England to be reunited with Ben, but not till 1947, March 1947. So we were apart quite a long time, but we were corresponding during that time. And that's it in a nutshell.
Thank you. Do we have another question? Could we go to the member on the first row?
Thank you so much for coming tonight. I was wondering, you mentioned how that, of course, was a time of great national events and everything, but of course, everyone had their very personal story. And I was wondering, in those times of horrific events, if you had the strength to even, for example, imagine a better life for you, and if you had any hopes and dreams that you could imagine for the future, or if it was very much just living in the present and surviving every single day?
Well, sometimes, you know, I'm asked, well, how did you manage to keep your hope? And I thought, well, did I have any hope? And I assume that people think I must have done, because I described this situation when we arrived in Ravensbrück, you know, of hope. Or without hope, there's no survival. So people assume I had it, but if I had it, it must have been in my subconscious. I wasn't one of those people that was consciously thinking, I must survive. Because I've seen titles of books, for instance, Holocaust books, where the title is, I will survive, and people are very determined to survive, but no one could really make that, however determined they were. Didn't mean to say that they'll make it. And a lot of it was luck as well. So we hoped, I subconsciously hoped, but consciously I was just kind of, in a way, overwhelmed by the whole situation, which made me, I don't know, people think that people were so brave, and they fought and they struggled and they determined to survive, but however determined you were, the conditions were such that to survive was very, very lucky. And well, I think I was extremely lucky.
Could we go to the member at the end of the first row?
Thank you. Despite this horrible experience, did you learn something that was guiding principles for your life?
Well, I think that in life one goes on learning forever till one dies, really, in a way. So that wasn't a sort of quick learning method of life. But I think that I've gained a sort of extra dimension that other people don't know about. So, I mean, I could say things like, well, I've learned to appreciate life and how precious it is, because we're all so vulnerable all the time. But I don't know. I really can't assess properly what it's taught me. You see, what it has taught some people is not very complimentary. I like not to trust anybody and how wicked the world is and all the negative things. But I haven't got any of those negative things. I still believe in people. And it sort of taught me that life is precious. And when I look back, I really don't know how I survived it all. And I attribute it to a lot of luck. But I did take measures in certain cases which I've told you and some I haven't told you about, that really without those I wouldn't have survived.
Why didn't you take the negative things that you mentioned from the experience, and why do you still believe in people?
Why didn't I take the negative things? Maybe I'm the sort of positive person. Maybe it's my disposition, my personality, I won't say my upbringing to a point. I did have a little bit of upbringing up to the age of, say, 12. I mean, the war broke out. I wasn't 9 yet. I was still 8. But I had my mother till the age of 12, and my father a little longer. But really, when I look at it, when I look back, I don't know how I managed to grow up into ordinary person, sensible person, and able. Well, one of the things that I was deprived of, and somebody actually earlier on when we were talking, and he said it, but I've been very aware of it all the time, that I was going through this experience during my formative years. So I was deprived of no schooling. I had 3 years, and then I had a year extra because I started a year early, and we didn't start school till 7, but we were in nursery before that. So I was deprived of my schooling, of all my nutrition that I needed to develop, of paternal sort of love, and all the normal things people do. One is developing between, say, 9 and 14. That's a very important part of the child's development. And that for me was just wasted, and it was not only wasted, but I mean, I was deprived of all those things. And I sometimes think, well, I wonder, how did I do it? I'm wondering as much as you, how did I manage to survive and be normal? But I actually, maybe I actually must attribute of it to my very happy marriage. I got married quite young. I was 19. I met the right person. My husband was actually, he was an architectural student when he was called up during the war. And he served 5.5 years in some very, very dangerous theaters of war. And then we met when he returned, and he married me. But I had a very happy marriage, and I think that accounts for a lot of the way I have developed. And I've also, I mention this because I'm in a place of learning, and you may be interested in that I've missed all that schooling. I won't talk about higher education. I was only 14 when the war finished. But I've actually managed to get a degree too, after my children were off my hands and at school, and I took classes, ending up with my required number of O-levels and A-levels. I was only doing them actually out of interest. I hadn't planned to do anything with it, but my daughter, who by then had a degree, said, well, why don't you go to university? And I said, well, you know, I wanted to do French, but it meant being away for a year, which I wouldn't have done from my family. So I changed to another subject, and well, I found a place at university, and I've got a degree in sociology. And again, people were saying, well, because you're ambitious, because you're this, because you're clever. But it wasn't, I just did it. It wasn't a determination. I didn't plan it very carefully, but I achieved it. So again, I was lucky.
We have time for some final questions. Could we go to the member in the colored scarf in the second row?
Have you always spoken about your experiences, or did you have times in your life where you found it too difficult? And what made you start to talk in public about what you experienced?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because, you know, there was a time when nobody talked about the Holocaust. And I remember at one point, I remember thinking, oh, no one is interested. Nobody's asking anything. Not that I wanted to be asked. But I can see it very clearly now that, and if I mention a biblical expression, I have learned that I'm not a great Bible, don't have a lot of knowledge about the Bible, but it does say in the Bible that there's a time for everything, and there's a time to speak and a time to stay silent. There's lots more like that, but I'll just stop at that. And that was the time to speak after the war. And I realized that people, you know, everybody suffered in the war, the British as well. They lost a lot of family, people, you know, in the forces, a lot of bombing, and lots of people were killed. And times were very tough after the war, because the recovery period took quite a long time. And that wasn't the time to talk. Everyone was too busy to try and get a home. It was impossible to get a flat or a house, and you didn't have the money, and jobs were short, and there was a lot happening. And so that wasn't the time to talk about the Holocaust. But it started very gradually, and people were interested. And I remember how I started, and it was just with the odd talk to a synagogue. I actually started there was a reunion in Israel of survivors worldwide, and they came from all over. I was there, my husband came with me, and I belonged to a group, an organization, and my friend said to me, very clever friend, wonderful woman, she said, look, Mara, take notes, and when you come back, you speak to the group, you tell us about it, about the reunion. And I said, oh no, I couldn't speak to a group. And she said, oh look, take notes anyway, just for yourself. But when I came back, they organized the meeting, and our meetings used to be very modest in somebody's lounge, and if we had 30 people, well, that was very crowded, and, you know, we're very pleased. But they had the wisdom to actually take not a hall, but a big room, like a small hall, but big room, locally in a building, and ever so many people turned up. There must have been about, I seem to remember either 70 or nearly 100. Anyway, a lot of people. And one of my friends said to me, you know, Mala, I've known you for so long, but I've never heard your story. And I said, well, you're not going to hear it today because I'm going to talk about the reunion. But inevitably, the story creeps in because people ask you during question time. So they learned a little bit about that. But after that, I used to speak just at the odd sort of youth club or church or a synagogue or some other organization. It was just here and there occasionally. But more recently, it's gone on the curriculum of the schools. The Holocaust is part of the curriculum. Probably a lot of you will know, you may have actually learned about it at school. But the earlier generations didn't learn it. So there is a situation now where children, well, young people, students, we call them, they go, they hear Holocaust at their school and they get very inspired, go home, they want to talk about it, and their parents don't know anything about it because they didn't learn about it. So one of the schools where I've been for 10th year running, one day, a few years ago, the teacher said to me, he told me this, and he said, would you be prepared to speak to the parents as well? And I said yes. He explained the necessity for it. And I said yes, but I really can't speak twice in one day. It's emotionally too much. And he said, no, we wouldn't expect you to do that. You come the day before, you stay the night, you speak to the parents in the evening, and the next day, it's a very special school because they do an amazing event. And the whole year participates in it. Some schools, it's only certain classes, but the whole year. And they prepare a lot of work in the morning. They do, you know, poetry and painting. And one year they even composed some music. And then in the after lunch, they produce whatever they have prepared, including a very short play, only 5 or 10 minutes. And when all that finishes, when all that's done, I speak. I'm the last speaker. So they have a really special event. And so what really I want to tell you that it is, you know, it's come about gradually when now it is very, very popular. Everybody wants to hear about the Holocaust. And I've heard some of the introductions when I speak, and the teachers say to these young people, well, we're going to hear from someone who's witnessed it, who's lived through it, and you should be really listening very attentively because your children won't have that opportunity. So of course, once you tell them that, I think that they're that much keener to learn about it from someone who was there. And of course, they're so far removed from, 75 years this month since the liberation. I mean, the people are already old who were born then, or well, getting on. So these children probably think, well, someone else won't be able to, I better listen attentively. Well, I assume all this, but that is the sort of speaking situation as it developed gradually.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions, but thank you so much again for coming here today. We're also honored to have heard you speak. Please join me in thanking Mala.